At around 3:40 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, a carter named Charles Cross was walking along Bucks Row here in Whitechapel when, in a gateway that used to stand here, he saw what he took to be a bundle lying on the ground. Thinking it was a tarpaulin that might prove useful, he went over to inspect it, but stopped in his tracks when he saw it was a woman lying there. Moments later, he heard footsteps behind him, and turning, saw another carter, Robert Paul, approaching. Nervously, the two men approached the silent form and stooped down over the body. Charles Cross felt the woman's hands. They were quite cold. Robert Paul, meanwhile, was leaning over, trying to see if he could detect any sign of breath. He couldn't. But when he touched the chest, he fancied it moved slightly. "I think she's breathing," he told his companion, "but very little, if she is." Paul wanted to sit the woman up, but Charles Cross didn't want to touch the body any further. So they thought they'd wasted enough time at the scene, so they pulled her skirts down to cover her decency and went on their way, agreeing to tell the first policeman they met of their find. But what neither man had noticed in the darkness was that the woman's throat had been cut so savagely that her head had almost been severed from her body.
That discovery was made by PC John Neal as he walked his beat along Bucks Row shortly after Cross and Paul had left the scene. It was he who raised the alarm and sent for local medic Dr. Llewellyn, who, having carried out a cursory examination of the body, gave orders for its removal to the mortuary. Here the night held a further shock, for when Inspector Spratling arrived to take down a description of the deceased, he discovered something that had so far eluded everyone. Beneath her blood-stained clothing, a deep gash ran along her abdomen. She had been disemboweled. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror had begun. The woman's name was Mary or Polly Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old prostitute who had earlier been ejected from a nearby lodging house because she didn't have the fourpence to pay for a bed. "I'll soon get my DOS money," she had confidently predicted. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got." That bonnet now lay trampled in a Whitechapel gutter.
Polly had her throat cut from left to right back to the spinal column. She had several incisions on her body. She was ripped up to the breastbone, but no organs were removed that we know of from Polly.
Elizabeth Long saw Annie Chapman at 5:30 in the morning outside number 27 Hanbury Street. Mrs. Long, who knew Annie by sight because they often stayed in the same common lodging house, told the police that Annie was not on her own. She was in the company of a man Mrs. Long described as dark and swarthy, a foreigner.
A little before 6 a.m. on the 8th of September 1888, John Davis, an elderly resident at number 29 Hanbury Street, came downstairs, walked along the narrow passageway and opened the back door. The sight that he saw shook him to his bones. Moments later, two workmen walking along Hanbury Street were suddenly startled when the door of number 29 burst open and a wild-eyed old man stumbled into the street. "Men," he cried, "come here." Nervously, they followed him down the passageway, and looking into the backyard, they saw the body of Annie Chapman lying between the steps and the fence.
Annie Chapman's throat was cut in two places, sort of two sections of cutting. She'd been ripped up to the breastbone. The small intestines were taken out of the body and placed over her right shoulder, and then two smaller flaps from the lower abdomen were placed over her left shoulder.
And there, in the corner of the yard, lay a freshly washed leather apron. The three previous murders had certainly caused disquiet in Whitechapel, but with the death of Annie Chapman, something happened. That disquiet gave way to panic and hysteria, as mobs began to turn their anger on anyone whom they thought might be responsible. The fact that a washed leather apron had been found so close to Annie's body led to anti-Semitism, and innocent Jews were threatened and abused by angry crowds.
It soon transpired that the leather apron found at the scene of the murder belonged to one of the residents of number 29 Hanbury Street and was not in any way connected to the murder or the murderer. This knowledge, however, did little to quell the racial unrest. As one newspaper reported, a touch would fire the whole district in the mood in which it is in now.
At 1 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of September, Louis Diemschutz turned his pony and cart into Duffield Yard off Berners Street. As he did so, his pony suddenly shied up in alarm and pulled away to the left. Something had disturbed it. Looking down, Diemschutz could just about discern a dark shape lying on the ground by the wall. Jumping from his cart, he struck a match to get a better view. It was very windy and the match was extinguished almost immediately. But in the brief seconds flickering light, he saw the bundle was in fact the prone form of a woman. He had discovered the body of Elizabeth Stride, Jack the Ripper's third victim.
Elizabeth Stride, also known as Long Liz in the area, some historians call her Lucky Liz because she only had her throat cut. There was no anatomical mutilation, so it's only a throat cut.
And this led the police to surmise that he'd been interrupted as he went about his bloody business. Is it possible that as he commenced the mutilations on Elizabeth Stride, the pony and cart turned into the yard and disturbed him? Did he jump back into the shadows? And was it that sudden movement that caused the pony to shy up and pull away to the left? And then crucially, in the days that followed the murder, a witness came forward who may well have seen Elizabeth Stride in the act of being murdered.
Israel Schwartz turned into Berners Street and he was walking just a short way behind another man. And up ahead was a woman standing in the gateway of a socialist club. And he saw this man approach the woman. They exchanged words. Then there was an altercation. He was violent with the woman. He threw her to the ground. Israel Schwartz crossed the road and walked on, trying to get away from what he thought was a piece of domestic violence going on. He subsequently identified the body of Elizabeth Stride, and the probability is that the man that he had followed up the street was the person who killed Elizabeth Stride. So he probably saw the murderer.
As the body of Elizabeth Stride was being discovered, a prostitute by the name of Catherine Eddowes, who had earlier been arrested for drunkenness, was being released from Bishopsgate Police Station. As she left the building, she turned to a police officer and spoke her last recorded words. "Good night, old cock," she called, and went off into the night. A little after 1:30 a.m, 3 Jewish gentlemen, Joseph Lowender, Joseph Levy and Harry Harris, left the Imperial Club on Duke's Place in the City of London. They noticed a man and a woman standing on a nearby corner. "I don't like going home by myself when I see those characters about," Levy observed to Harris. Lowender, meanwhile, was walking slightly apart from the others, and being closer to the couple, observed a little more. He was later emphatic that the woman he had seen was Catherine Eddowes. The man, he said, was aged about 30. His height was between 5'7" and 5'8". He had a fair complexion and a fair moustache. He was of medium build and had the appearance of a sailor. But since the couple seemed to be just chatting quietly, and there was nothing otherwise noteworthy about them, the 3 men continued on their way.
It's entirely possible that Joseph Lowender did see the Ripper, but he only got a very brief glance at the man, and it wasn't even totally certain that the man he saw was talking to Catherine Eddowes.
At 1:45 in the morning, PC Watkins of the City Police walked his beat here into Mitre Square. The only noise he heard was the sound of his own footsteps. He'd walked this way 15 minutes previous and found the square to be quite deserted. Little now seemed to have changed as he shone his lantern into the square's dark recesses. But when the beam fell upon the spot in the square's south corner, it illuminated a horrific sight. the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes.
The injuries that Catherine sustained were really horrific in Mitre Square. She had her throat cut from left to right back to the spinal column. The murderer then ripped her up to the breastbone, disemboweled her, took away her kidney. He then placed her intestines over the shoulder. But not only that, to her body he actually disemboweled her, of course, which happened to most of the victims, but it was her facial injuries which were sort of really notorious, because he cut off the section of her nose, he partially severed her ear, he slashed her face continuously, and then also had V-shaped triangular flaps underneath her eyes, just there.